All right, take two. Welcome to the quadruple D. And I guess this is the special Christmas 2025 episode. And what Christmas episode would be complete without discussing Latin America's far right shift, right? Isn't that what comes to mind when you think of Christmas or the holiday season in general? Okay, just a little bit of humor before we get into somewhat more serious topics, and before I get into the election of Asfura in Honduras, I have to talk about Javier Milei a little bit first. So go ahead and look at that main photo that I selected for this episode. Every time I see a photo of Javier Milei, he looks like a drunken werewolf who was photographed after being hit with silver, and he's mid transformation into being a human again. Granted, maybe he's actually just stuck in the early stages of lycanthropy, I don't know, but there's a heavy werewolf vibe to him nonetheless. I wonder when his eyes will turn yellow or red. Maybe it'll be like a blend of yellow and red. I don't know what the actual type of werewolf he would be is. And of course, the Trump regime sent Milei $40 billion at one point. Now, does that sound like America first? Does that really sound like that type of policy? And this is at a time when America is slashing domestic spending, including not just welfare spending, but even funding for the science and technology. All of that sort of research is being slashed as well. Maybe not all of it, but if it's not going directly into the military budget, it seems like it's getting slashed. Oddly enough, I did Google whether or not anyone else saw a resemblance between Millet and a werewolf, and it's come up. Some people have mentioned that he does look like a werewolf. Also, he, interestingly enough, ended a werewolf law in Argentina. And here's what I learned about the law that he ended. It was an Argentine superstition rooted in a rural myth, which held that the seventh consecutive son in a family would turn into a lobison, or a werewolf. So, to protect the child from this fate and prevent discrimination, a 1974 law decreed that the president would become their godfather. So, when Millet ended that law, it actually sounds like maybe he wants them to become werewolves, so it's really infitting, or fitting in with the vibe of him being pro werewolf or something like that. And that was a real law, I guess. The story is apparently not fake. But anyway, Millet is also the goofball who gifted Elon Musk that chainsaw. I don't know if you remember that. And it was one of Elon's many cringeworthy moments. It's to symbolize Elon's interest in illegally slashing all sorts of government departments. And remember, Joe Biden was somehow legally barred from forgiving student loans, yet somehow Trump and Elon Musk are able to slash entire departments. Like recently, a judge decided that Trump can impose massive $100,000 fees on H 1B visas, but Joe Biden somehow had no power to forgive student debt? That doesn't make sense. Anyway, it's more evidence that our government sucks ass and right wing ideology is rotten to the core. Also, this H 1B fee that effectively restricts the free movement of skilled labor across borders, that's a violation of free trade principles. And of course, tariffs are against free trade as well, but there's no logical consistency in right wing ideology. It never has been logically consistent, and it never will be. So, anyway, on to the election of Asfuras in Honduras, assuming it goes through. So, Honduras, they have a deeply compromised electoral system, and it delivered another contested outcome this week as conservative politician Nasri Asfura was declared president following a prolonged and disputed vote count that further eroded public trust in state institutions already weakened by decades of corruption, U.S. interference, and authoritarian governance. So, electoral authorities announced Wednesday that Asfura, a longtime figure with the National Party, secured 40.27% of the vote in the November 30 election, and his nearest rival, Salvador Nasrallah of the Liberal Party, himself a repeat candidate backed by business interests and media power, trailed narrowly with 39.53%. And the slim margin and weeks long delay in certification uh, reignited fears of manipulation in a country whose electoral credibility has been questioned repeatedly since the 2009 US-backed coup that removed President Manuel Zelaya. So, Asfira is a former mayor of Tegucigalpa. I think I'm pronouncing that right. I even did look up the pronunciation, but he claimed victory amid celebrations at his campaign headquarters, even as election officials, opposition figures, and civil liberty groups continued to challenge the legitimacy of the process. Observers noted that the drawn out count echoed the 2017 election crisis when National Party candidate Juan Orlando Hernandez, later extradited to the United States on drug trafficking charges and later pardoned by Donald Trump despite trafficking in literal tons of cocaine. Anyway, back then Hernandez was controversially declared the winner following a sudden reversal in results. So there's all sorts of confusion going on here. But as Ferris said on X, or what normal people call Twitter, Honduras, I am prepared to govern. I will not let you down. Well, we'll see about that. I have my own immediate suspicions that yes, he will probably let people down. And the outcome effectively sidelined the governing Liberty and Reformation Party, or Libre, whose democratic socialist platform emerged in response to the post coup repression of grassroots movements, labor organizers, and indigenous communities. So Libre's candidate finished a distant third with 19.19%, signaling both voter fatigue and the structural limits placed on reformist politics within a system dominated by elites, militarized policing, and international capital. And international reaction followed familiar geopolitical lines. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Little Marco, publicly endorsed the result because, of course, stating on X, or I should say excreting on X. Anyway, this is what he said: "The people of Honduras have spoken. The Trump administration looks forward to working with his administration to advance prosperity and security in our hemisphere." Well, we'll see about that. But anyway, the European Union and right wing leaders across Latin America, including Argentine President Javier Milei, also issued congratulatory messages. So they're patting each other on the back, until they, of course, stab each other in the back in some way, which is a pretty common theme in right wing politics as well. And fortunately, in many ways, it is a common theme. But as Fear's rise fits squarely within a broader regional realignment favoring authoritarian neoliberalism, arriving just 1 week after Chile elected far right politician Jose Antonio Kast. While framed by corporate media as a pragmatic shift, such transitions typically strengthen extractive industries, suppress labor resistance, and expand police and military power, often with tacit or explicit U.S. backing. So, with Little Marco endorsing, the win in Honduras, it's actually pretty explicit U.S. backing at this point. Trump personally endorsed Asfira days before the election, declaring him the only Honduran candidate Washington would cooperate with. So that sounds like a freedom-loving president right there. Like, I'm only going to cooperate with people who align with the far right, and anybody else I'm going to like try to completely distance myself from. Is that really strong leadership? I don't know. That's debatable. Of course, it's also debatable whether or not we need leaders in the first place. But I'll put that aside for now. And this sort of intervention by Trump, this endorsement, was consistent with decades of U.S. policy in Central America, where electoral legitimacy has routinely taken a back seat to alignment with U.S. so called security and so called economic interests, particularly in countries hosting U.S. military assets such as air bases. And Asfura campaigned heavily on infrastructure projects completed during his tenure as mayor, which admittedly doesn't sound so bad if there's truth to it. But watchdog groups have raised questions about contracting practices and the concentration of public resources, while they're concentrated in urban areas, while rural and indigenous regions continue to face displacement, poverty, and environmental destruction. So it sounds like a little bit of good old fashioned environmental racism, perhaps, thrown into the mix. Because if you have a right wing government, well, why not have that as well? It fits right in with the overall theme here. And the election's outcome echoes a familiar pattern: a rotating cast of elite managed parties competing for control of a state apparatus that's designed to protect capital rather than people. So the narrow margins, the external endorsements, and they're all coming from authoritarian leaders. Uh, it's also a matter of institutional fragility, and we're seeing how this is probably not some sort of democratic renewal, but the persistence of a system that's structurally incapable of delivering genuine self determination to Hondurans. And I suppose that's implied by the election of leaders in the first place. But, theoretically, one of the goals of having politicians is that they can do the hard work while the rest of the people can just relax, sit on the sidelines, have normal lives, and all that kind of stuff. But it seems like some hardship is right around the corner. I'm sure some hardship is already there, but far right policies, they're going to end up harming the population one way or the other. And rather than resolving the country's political crisis, the election appears to have reaffirmed it, leaving grassroots movements, mutual aid, and community organizers once again confronting power from outside the ballot box. All right, I've got another segment here, and we're talking again about Javier Milei. And normally I call this segment the peripheral poop head of the week, but I'm not sure to what extent he is on the periphery. So let's just call him the poop head of the week, I guess. So before becoming president, Javier Milei built a public profile as a media provocateur rather than as a conventional party figure. Throughout the 2010s, he appeared frequently on Argentine television, using aggressive rhetoric to attack politicians, central banking, and state spending. His performances, often angry and theatrical, which actually make him look like a werewolf, as I previously discussed, helped him cultivate an image as an outsider, confronting what he called la casta politica, a term he uses for the governing elite. Of course, the irony here is that he is one of the governing elite. Like all of these so-called right-wing populists, they end up catering to the billionaires and multimillionaires We don't want to leave the millionaires out of here. They figure into this stuff too. Don't get me wrong. Like a lot of the media, they emphasize the billionaires, and I get it. They're definitely the ones who get the most love and affection from the far right. But nevertheless, if you've got like hundreds of millions of dollars, they'll probably keep their ear open to what you have to say. But anyway, Millet was born in Buenos Aires on October 1970, October 22nd, 1970, if you want to celebrate his birthday next year, just so you know when he was born. He studied economics at the University of Belgrano, a private university. And I guess I can't judge him too much for that because I also attended a private university, the prestigious Finlandia University, which no longer exists. That's how exclusive it is now. It's no longer even there. But Millet later completed postgraduate degrees at well known centers for orthodox and neoliberal economic thought in Argentina. He worked as an economics lecturer, mainly teaching macroeconomics and lycanthropy. Oops, I snuck that joke in there. And he held advisory roles in the private financial sector, and his academic background aligns closely with neoclassical economics rather than with heterodox or popular economic traditions common in Argentina. In 2021, Milei entered formal politics and won a seat in the Chamber of Deputies, representing the city of Buenos Aires under the banner of La Libertad Avanza. While in Congress, he rarely introduced legislation. Instead, he used the position as a platform to denounce public spending, unions, and social welfare programs because, of course. And he publicly promised not to raise taxes and made a show of raffling off his deputy's salary each month, a move that reinforced his anti politician persona but did not alter the material structure of state power. Milei won the presidency in November of 2023 after defeating Sergio Massa, who was serving as economy minister during a period of high inflation. Annual inflation in Argentina exceeded 140% in 2023. Very high, no doubt about it, driven by long-standing structural problems, debt obligations, and reliance on the International Monetary Fund. And I'll get more into that a little bit later on in the next segment. So Millet blamed Kirchnerism and socialism for the crisis, despite Argentina operating for decades within a capitalist framework shaped by export dependence, financialization, and repeated IMF agreements. So, since taking office as Argentina's 59th president, Milei has pushed a sharp austerity agenda. His administration moved to slash subsidies, deregulate prices, weaken labor protections, and reduce the role of the state in healthcare, education, and social assistance. So these are all things that are sometimes called anarcho-capitalism. You know, that's what they sometimes will call these things, like it's some sort of anarchism. But from an actual anarchist perspective, these measures do not dismantle authority, but instead shift power toward corporations, landlords, and international finance, while preserving the coercive core of the state, including police, courts, and prisons. So, right off the bat, you know it's probably not some anarchist type of thing. And of course, the first rat to be smelled is if this is really anarchism of some type, why does it need a president, somebody at the top, to impose it, as a policy? That's not really how anarchism typically works, right? I mean, it's kind of implied that it's a very bottom up type of philosophy and movement. But there were large protests against his policies, and they have been met with expanded policing powers and restrictions on demonstrations. Now, does that sound like a type of anarchic freedom? scenario? No, that sounds like authoritarianism, not liberty or anything like that. If you're expanding policing powers and putting restrictions on protests, well, that's like the exact opposite of any sort of anarchist ideal. And, it really shows you that the state remains central to enforcing his program. And Millet describes himself as a libertarian, which is a joke, and frequently references anarcho capitalist thinkers such as Murray Rothbard. And he supports laissez faire capitalism, privatization, and a minimal state limited mainly to security and property enforcement. Gee, I wonder why that would be the case. Why would the government be necessary to protect property? Well, it's almost as if anarcho-capitalist ideology is a bunch of nonsense, and it's always contradicted by reality whenever you have any sort of, I don't know, freedom-loving right winger get in office who fancies himself, a true blue capitalist type. Well, they always end up relying on the government to enforce their agenda. So, again, from an actual anarchist standpoint, anarcho capitalism is not considered a form of that ideology at all, since it retains class hierarchy, private domination, and wage labor, while relying on organized violence to protect property rights. On social issues, he's not very liberty minded either. Millet opposes abortion and euthanasia, positions that conflict with bodily autonomy as understood in anarchic traditions. He supports civilian gun ownership and favors deregulation of drug use and prostitution, framing these as matters of individual choice. Well, in reality, we know why he would be in favor of that. He just wants his right wing buddies to be able to openly have Epstein style drug fueled sex parties, more than likely. And it's a way for these people to all unleash their inner werewolves, I suppose. And in foreign policy, he has aligned Argentina more closely with the United States and Israel. Keep in mind, Israel is mid genocide right now. And it's really reinforcing existing geopolitical hierarchy rather than challenging imperial power. So he's also not very anarchic in that sense either. And Malay is also known for his flamboyant style and slogans, most notably Viva la Libertad, Carajo. Despite the language of freedom, his presidency illustrates a familiar pattern. The state withdraws support from the people, from the poor, while strengthening its capacity to discipline dissent, all in service of capital rather than any genuine liberation. So the werewolf strikes, you might say. I I I know I'm using the werewolf joke a little bit too much, but what can I say? The dude looks like a friggin' werewolf. You got to keep bringing it up when he's around, you know. And when the moon is bright in the sky, you better watch out because he's going to be extra intense during those moments. All right, on to the third segment, which I call the fetid fever dream flashback of the week. And this time I'm looking at Domingo Cavallo, who is somebody that Javier Milei really admires, and he's in some instances said that he's a big influence on his own political ideology. So Domingo uh, Cavallo has been involved in many controversies, but the biggest scandal associated with him is the role he played in Argentina's neoliberal transformation of the 1990s, especially the convertibility plan and the policies that led to the 2001 economic collapse. So it's not a single corruption case so much as a systemic scandal with massive social consequences. So I'll break it down, and then because we're talking about anarcho capitalism here, I will assess it from more of an anarchist perspective. So the core scandal, the convertibility and the road to 2011. or 2001. I keep I keep on messing that up. But anyway, here's what Cavallo did as economy minister under Carlos Menem from 1991 to 1996, and later under Fernando de la Rua in 2001. He pegged the Argentine peso 1 to 1 to the US dollar, which was the convertibility plan. He opened the economy aggressively to global finance, oversaw mass privatization of public services, that's water, energy, telecoms, pensions, you name it, took on huge amounts of foreign debt, and enforced austerity to satisfy the IMF and creditors. So at first, inflation collapsed and middle class Argentines felt richer. So it seemed to be going quite well at first, to the point where people probably weren't quick to complain. But the model depended on constant borrowing, capital inflows, and confidence from international markets. So by the late 1990s, industry collapsed under cheap imports, unemployment and informal work exploded, and debt became unpayable. The economy was effectively run to please creditors, not people. So in 2001, Cavallo returned to power and imposed the Corralito, freezing bank accounts. That directly triggered mass protests, riots, and state repression that killed dozens. The government collapsed, and millions were pushed into poverty almost overnight. So the initial positive vibes of this policy were no longer so positive. And this crisis was predictable and widely warned about. Cavallo defended the model even as it was clearly failing. Ordinary people paid the price for policies that protected banks and investors. No one at the top was meaningfully punished, of course. And this wasn't a mistake in the narrow sense, it was a political choice with known risks. And then there was a secondary scandal, the arms trafficking scandal, also in the Menem era. So, during Menem's presidency, Argentina illegally sold weapons to Ecuador and Croatia. Cavallo later claimed he opposed it and eventually exposed it, but it happened while he was a central figure in government. It showed the level of corruption and impunity of the regime that he served, and he benefited politically from Menem's system until it collapsed. Even if Cavallo wasn't the mastermind, he was embedded in that power structure. So let's get into the sort of anarchic assessment here. Again, I'm doing this because Milei is likened to an anarcho-capitalist, right? So from an actual anarchic perspective, Cavallo's legacy is deeply negative, not just because of bad outcomes, which frankly could probably happen in any society if certain things just go wrong. But anyway, this demonstrates point number one: rule by technocrats over people. So actual anarchists reject the idea that society should be run by economists, central bankers, or experts insulated from democratic control. Cavallo embodied technocratic power. Decisions were made in ministries, the IMF, and financial markets. There was no meaningful participation from workers or communities in general. Social harm was treated as an acceptable adjustment cost. So, from this view, convertibility wasn't just flawed economics, it was authoritarian governance. Okay, point number two: state power was used to protect capital in the classic formulation. So, genuine anarchists would argue that the state exists largely to defend property and capital, and Cavallo's policies fit that analysis perfectly. I'm probably mispronouncing the dude's name at times. But anyway, profits were privatized, losses were socialized, and when the system collapsed, savings were frozen and protests were repressed. So the Corralitos, that whole idea is especially damning from an anarchic lens. The state literally intervened to stop people from accessing their own money, all to save the financial system. And point number three, there was dependency and imperialism. So, of course, anarchists are deeply critical of institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. So, Cavallo, he tied Argentina's economy to US monetary policy, which is something that Milei is hell bent on doing. He accepted IMF conditions that deepened inequality. He reduced national and local autonomy in favor of global finance. So, from this perspective, his project reinforced economic colonialism, making Argentina dependent on foreign capital and vulnerable to crisis. Uh, be more vulnerable because it was depending on outsiders, you know, sort of uniquely dependent, willingly dependent, if you will. So, point number four is that the social consequences were ignored, and anarchism centers around lived experience, not abstract indicators. Under Cavallo's model, neighborhoods organized soup kitchens while bondholders were paid, workers occupied and self managed factories after the collapse. And I guess there's a movie about that by Naomi Klein that you could check out. And mutual aid emerged despite the state, not because of it. So, ironically, the post 2011 or 2001, I keep wanting to say 11, I don't know why. But anyway, that the post 2001 explosion of horizontal assemblies and worker cooperatives is often cited by anarchists as evidence that people organize better when top-down systems fail. So there's a little bit of irony here. you know, some elements of anarchic organizing did thrive because of these policies, but not directly because of them, but in response to them. So workers were recuperating factories not because they like were radical or interested in left wing politics, but because they needed to do something like that just to survive. So the bottom line here is that the biggest scandal involving Domingo Cavallo isn't a single illegal act or anything like that. It's that his policies devastated millions of lives in the name of economic orthodoxy, and he never accepted responsibility. So Cavallo represents the danger of concentrated economic power, the violence hidden in supposedly neutral financial decisions, and the state acting as an enforcer for capital, not as a protector for people. And that's really one of the ironic parts of this is that these these right wing ideologies that promote law and order, they ultimately cause the crumbling of law and order. And these same people who would frequently bash left wing anarchist type movements or left wing movements in general, they end up sort of forcing the population to move more to the left if they want to withstand the harshness of these policies that are being imposed. So they actually create the very enemy that they seek to fight with their lousy policies. Anyway, that's it for today's episode. I hope I got in some nice werewolf jokes that might have made you laugh because he sure does look like a werewolf. And Merry Christmas or Happy Holidays, whatever it is, Hanukkah. I've, I'm I can't think of. I'm blanking on other holidays. Festivus, if you're a celebrator of Festivus. Anyway, uh, have a good one.